I'm Lavanja Rajamani. I'm a professor at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. It's a center that looks at a whole range of issues. We are an interdisciplinary center. We have projects here looking at accountability in governance. We have projects here looking at urbanization across India, the urbanization process, and project looks at issues of transport, issues relating to planning in New Delhi. So it's a range of issues that are looked at in the urbanization project. We have a project on history and foreign policy. My project is on climate change. As I was saying, my center is an interdisciplinary center, and we have lawyers, political scientists, economists, policy specialists here. I'm an international lawyer. I work on climate change issues. And we have an initiative at the center called the Climate Initiative. We have 3 research associates and 2 senior fellows working on this project. We look at both domestic and international issues. And as I said, I'm an international lawyer, so I'm looking primarily at treaty negotiations, looking at issues of treaty law, issues relating to compliance in the international climate change regime, looking at design of new instruments, architecture of the new international instrument that is likely to come out in the next few years. These are the kinds of issues that I work on. My colleagues work on issues relating to domestic climate policy, and I also have some linkages. My work also has some linkages with domestic climate policy. In the last few years, climate policy in India has evolved quite dramatically, especially in the run-up to Copenhagen. One of the big milestones as far as climate change policy in India was concerned was the National Action Plan on Climate Change that came out in the run-up to Copenhagen. And although initially the action plan was very much a broad sort of framework to guide policy actions in India, over time it has become very substantive. There are missions created under each under the National Action Plan, missions, for instance, on solar energy, on forestation and reforestation, on the Himalayas, on glaciers, and each of these missions have now been fleshed out. So we have quite a solid sort of set of policy instruments that we're using in India now to address climate change, and these will only be scaled up over time. So the process of that I was engaged in Copenhagen was actually, and in the run-up to Copenhagen, was in sifting through submissions of parties. Over 190 parties had submitted proposals for what the agreed outcome of the Bali Action Plan should be. And I was involved in that process with Ambassador Michael Zamet-Kuttyar and his team of assistants, and also the Secretariat. We helped with drafting legal text that parties could work with. The crafting of that legal text was actually an extraordinarily difficult and finely balanced process, primarily because the form of the outcome was not clear at that time, and it still is not clear. The Bali Action Plan had only specified that parties should reach an agreed outcome at Copenhagen. They did not specify what form that agreed outcome should be or should take, whether it should be a legally binding instrument, whether it should be a conference of parties decision. And drafting legal text without knowing what form that text would take is actually an extraordinarily difficult and finely balanced process. But for an international lawyer, it was a fascinating exercise to be part of. At Copenhagen, of course, the work that we did, the Secretariat and Ambassador Michael Zamet-Kuttyar's team, was useful in the first week, but by the time the second week came along and the heads of states started arriving, they found that there were far too many brackets in the text. It was going to be impossible to actually convert that text into an agreed outcome in Copenhagen. So as a result, what happened was the heads of state then took over the process and drafted their own text. And that is a text that came to be known as the Copenhagen Accord. The drafting of the Copenhagen Accord was a fascinating process in itself. It's the first time in recorded history, or at least as far as I know, where heads of state, 30-odd heads of states, have actually sat together and negotiated text. It's usually the kind of task that's left to diplomats to do, and heads of states arrive and sign off on it and take the obligatory sort of photograph at the end of it, taking credit for it. But heads of state worked overnight in 16 hours straight in sessions and actually negotiated text, which has now, over time, come to be incorporated in the FCCC process through the Cancun agreements and will be taken forward in the years to come. Two questions that I've been asked: what I think of the Accord, or how I would assess it, and what role heads of states played in drafting this Accord, and what implications the role that heads of state played in this negotiation actually has had on the evolution of the climate regime. The Accord itself at the time was seen as too little, too late. It identified a global goal of 2 degrees, but that had been done by the G8 several months in advance. But although it identified that global goal for 2050, it did not specify what burden sharing there would be to achieve that goal. It did not have quantitative targets and timetables. It did not actually tell us how we would reach where we needed to go. In addition to that, it contained provisions on mitigation, but they were fairly limited. There were, as I said, no quantitative goals in the context also of the mitigation paragraphs of the Accord. The financial provisions in the Accord are seen as one of the more substantive outcomes from the Copenhagen process. But the short-term sort of target between 2010 and 2012 of $30 billion is yet to be met. Some do say that it will be met, but it depends on how you calculate it and how you determine whether it's additional to ODA or not. So it's safe to say that there are differing perceptions on how effectively even the financial provisions have actually been implemented. In terms of the role that heads of state played in it, at some level, and several scholars do believe this, some of the compromises that were struck could not have been struck except at that level, because the negotiations clearly had run up against a dead end. Parties were repeating the same positions. There was no mandate to go beyond the positions that diplomats were already articulating. So perhaps those negotiations and those compromises could only be made at the head of state level. So it was useful at that level to have interaction from heads of states and have the negotiations between heads of states. The most sort of telling moment, of course, of the Copenhagen Accord negotiations was the moment with Obama and the basic countries, which really does give you an indication of how the geopolitics have changed and who it is that is actually central and crucial in these negotiations at the end of the day. The deal was struck between Obama and the heads of states of Brazil, India, China, and South Africa, and they went back to the bigger group, and it had to be accepted because it was accepted by these 5 countries. But the process in general did lead also to a lot of tensions in the negotiations. Tensions between the negotiators and heads of states, which always exist in these kinds of processes, but tensions also in terms of how those the head of state negotiations translated into the UN process, or was sort of injected into the UN process. And it was because of lack of finessing of that negotiation and that sort of relationship between the Accord negotiations at the heads of state level and the UN process that the Accord was actually rejected by the Bolivarian alliance. They felt excluded by the negotiating process. They felt marginalized by it. They felt that decisions were being taken without them, and as sovereign states in the UN process, every state has an equal right and an equal voice, and that was not respected. As a result, what of the rejection of the Copenhagen Accord, it took an extra year to actually inject some of the compromises from this negotiation into the UN process. And some of that has been done in the Cancun agreements, but it took an extra year to do that. And part of what the Cancun agreements did was not just to incorporate some of the compromises that were struck in Copenhagen in the Accord, but also to iron out some of the creases in the Copenhagen Accord. When negotiations occur at the head of state level, there's likely to be some loss of technical detail, some inelegancies which will creep in because of lack of knowledge about the technical details of what's actually happening. And some of that had to be sorted out in Cancun. To give you a quick example, for instance, communications from non-Annex 1 countries, national communications from developing countries, technically are meant to be every 4 or 5 years, although they happen at much longer intervals. From developed countries, they happen every 5 years. But there is intended to be a distinction between developed and developing countries in terms of how often they report on the actions that they're taking domestically. The Copenhagen Accord essentially asked developing countries to produce national communications every 2 years. Now that's an absurdly high sort of standard for anybody, developed or developing. And what we see in the Cancun agreements is an agreement that roughly every 4 years, developed and developing countries will produce national communications. Now, that's an example of heads of state thinking, well, you know, sure, we can produce national communications every 2 years without realizing the process that's involved in the reporting, the kinds of technical detail and detail that's needed to put into these national communications. So the Cancun agreements actually ironed out some of those details because the heads of state level, this is not what they are meant to know. This is not what's part of their role. So some of those inelegancies and creases were sort of ironed out in Cancun. Whether the nature of the intergovernmental process is adequate to the task of actually resolving the climate change problem, given the urgency of actually taking action on climate change. Now that's a difficult question, as you know. Given the substantive outputs of the recent conferences of parties, whether it's Copenhagen or Cancun, the substantive outputs have been quite dismal, especially in terms of mitigation. For instance, in Cancun, what we essentially decided was to take note of documents containing mitigation pledges from developed and developing countries, but we took note of documents that did not exist. They did not exist in December when we took note of them. The documents, only one of the documents exists today. The implication or the understanding was that those documents would contain pledges that had been incorporated under the Copenhagen Accord, but they were not part of the UN process. And this is one of the points that the Bolivian ambassador made when he objected to the Cancun agreements, was that we're taking note of documents that don't exist. And even if they do exist, the kinds of pledges that they're going to contain, if they're based on the Copenhagen Accord, are pledges that are not going to meet the 2-degree goal. In fact, they're far more likely to be consistent with a 3 or 4 degree warming trend. So clearly, the international process is not contributing to the goal that we've stated in the international process of actually meeting 2 degrees. There's no guarantee that we'll meet 2 degrees, especially now. But having said that, is there value to the international process anyway? And I think there is. And the reason I think there is because at least we're having conversations on these issues. We need a lot more than just the international process. The international process is not the be-all or the end-all of solving this problem. The international or the multilateral UN-based process, the architecture of the existing instruments, the architecture of the instruments that we're negotiating, we will need all of that to create the right incentives to take action domestically, regionally, locally. So there's certainly not, it's not the be-all and end-all of what we need to do to address the problem. But we do need it because we need a multilateral fora in which all countries have equal voice. No other fora has that, whether it's the Major Economies Forum or G8 or even G20. It's a big boys club. It doesn't involve or accommodate the interests of the small island developing states or the vulnerable states. They're usually not included in these other negotiating fora. You need a negotiating fora which has a diverse range of interests, because that is the diversity and complexity of the international community. And if we don't have that reflected in a fora which is negotiating an issue that is so central to the challenges that we face today, we will not be able to resolve the issue. It's not the only thing that we need, the multilateral negotiating process, but it's certainly an important part of the puzzle. So I think we need more, a lot more, but the international process is very much part of that puzzle to actually solve the climate change problem. Is the extent to which we need new models of global governance such that there's representation for a wider set of interests, representation beyond the nation state, for instance, representation from cities and non-state actors, and how these might be integrated into the international negotiation process. Interests other than state interests are already reflected in the negotiations, but this is a very limited role that's provided. And as you know, there are sort of parallel events that take place with the negotiations, events that are suited to non-state actors and that are designed by non-state actors, and that helps inject a certain perspective into the negotiations. But over time, the linkages between the kinds of actions that non-state actors are taking, local governments are taking, are not necessarily linking back into the negotiations as well as they could. And in part, this is because when it comes down to crunch time, when in the last few days of negotiations, many states are not included in the green room negotiations, as we call them. This is 30 countries sitting around a table, 30 consequential countries that are sitting around a table. Many states are not represented, so it's impossible to actually find a space in that context to represent interests that are not state-based. But having said that, I think there's a role for non-state actors, for local governments, for indigenous peoples, all the constituencies that are affected by climate change, to actually inject some of their perspectives into any process that is looking at decisions that are going to affect them, decisions on climate change policy. And there are various levels at which this can happen. It is not necessarily important for local governments, for instance, to inject their views into the international negotiations. Local governments can have exchanges with other local governments in other parts of the world. Cities can use best practices and export those best practices to other cities of similar scale with similar sorts of problems. So there are exchanges that need to happen at lots of different levels. It's not necessarily important to inject it into the international negotiations, because the negotiations can only cover a certain subset of issues, a small set of issues of the larger set that actually needs to be addressed. And the larger set involves initiatives between states, between cities, between indigenous people in different parts of the world. It requires networks at lots of different levels, not just at the global level. So we need to disaggregate the kinds of networks that we're talking about and diffuse knowledge through those different networks to be able to effectively address the challenge of climate change. I think social networks are very useful for consciousness raising and for communicating information to large numbers of people in very short spaces of time. But these social networks don't necessarily have the ability to communicate very complex and detailed information in the same sort of way. So you can communicate bullet point information to large numbers of people. So it helps perhaps in uprisings and helps in building consciousness and reacting to situations when you need those kinds of reactions. But I think the kind of considered policy response that we need to climate change requires far stronger knowledge networks and far stronger knowledge bases for these kinds of evolved dialogues and conversations. And unless you have those kind of fairly evolved dialogues and conversations, I don't think the input into the negotiations will be as useful or as effective. There have, of course, been very detailed and compulsive analyses of what went wrong in Copenhagen, how things could have been better, and whether things would have been doomed anyway, given the substantive divergences between parties. There have been various sort of post-mortems and analyses of Copenhagen. There are a few issues, though, that I think could certainly be addressed better and could have been addressed better. One of them was just the confidence building that is necessary in the run-up to a major negotiation of this sort was not effectively done. And I'm talking about confidence building between developed and developing countries. And I recognize when I use the term developing countries, there are a wide array of developing countries and the great divergences between them. So I'm not using them as a monolithic category, but having said that, there are in the negotiations some broad groupings around developed, developing countries, LDCs or least developed countries. And there needs to be, in the run-up to any big negotiation, a very concerted effort to build confidence in your negotiating partners. And you can only do that or create that goodwill through a whole series of measures. And not just the Danes, but various more sort of influential actors in the negotiating process perhaps did not invest enough in that confidence building exercise, whether it is with the Bolivarian alliance that eventually rejected the Copenhagen Accord, or with small island states like Tuvalu and others, or some of the African nations. There just wasn't enough confidence building that was done in the run-up to Copenhagen. And some of those things need to change, and over time Cancun played a role in changing some of that perception that there wasn't confidence in the system. And the reason there wasn't confidence was because in the run-up to Copenhagen there were fairly serious sort of proposals made to find a new instrument that would replace the Kyoto Protocol. Now the EU has since said that they would be quite willing to accept second commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol and to perpetuate it, assuming other conditions are right. But having said that, the Kyoto Protocol is an instrument that is of tremendous significance, symbolic significance in part, to developing countries. It contains a certain unique form of burden sharing, where developed countries, because in at least the developing country view, developed countries have historical responsibility for creating the problem. If they do, then they should take leadership and take on targets and timetables, in more stringent targets and in quicker timetables than developing countries. And the Kyoto Protocol embodies that view. Now, when darts were thrown, for instance, at the Kyoto Protocol in the run-up to Copenhagen, it shook the confidence of many developing countries, also because a lot of the targets in the Kyoto Protocol, at least from current estimates, are unlikely to be met. So there isn't now, and there wasn't then certainly, confidence in one's negotiating partners. If you don't have confidence in the goodwill or the good faith elements of your negotiating partners, you're not likely to have a negotiated outcome that's fair to all, that's effective, and that's helpful in progressing the debate. So there was far less confidence in the system at the time, and so in a sense the Copenhagen negotiations were set up to fail. There was a lot of mistrust between negotiating partners. But in addition, one of the issues that was not dealt with very well were the process issues in Copenhagen. The Danes, for instance, produced a text, an alternate text in the negotiations, which was not derived from submissions of parties. It was derived from their little team of experts. And that is never a good move in an international negotiating process, because countries have made submissions. As I said, I worked on many of these submissions. There were thousands of pages of submissions. If countries have taken the time to put their views on paper and to produce it and represent it in these international negotiations, they do not appreciate a text coming in from outside. That is a lesson learned from Copenhagen, I think, that any of the negotiating texts have to emerge from the negotiating process. That's a lesson that we need to learn in the negotiating process. It was followed to some extent in Cancun, but there were some question marks about the origin and the extent to which some of the text was actually negotiated in Cancun. But we need, at a minimum, to ensure there's confidence in the system, there's trust between negotiating partners, and that did not exist in the run-up to Copenhagen for a whole series of reasons. You need to identify the reasons and ensure that those reasons are addressed, and that therefore there's confidence and trust in the system before you can expect any international negotiation to actually yield results. Injecting science into the climate negotiations, what processes currently exist to do that, in relation to the extent to which some states believe more or less in the gravity of the climate change problem, and therefore how that influences negotiations. So as far as the sort of formal channels there are for science to influence the outcomes, one of the subsidiary bodies under the climate change negotiations is the subsidiary body on scientific and technological advice, and that body does have mandate to look at scientific issues. It considers information. It considers, for instance, when we do have assessment reports from the IPCC, they are considered by the subster and by the Conference of Parties, and decisions are taken in relation to that. There's also been an effort in the negotiations to inject some of the scenarios, or at least to tailor the outcomes to some of the scenarios identified in thus far the fourth assessment report. In box 13.7, it identifies a range of scenarios, and the scenario that we're working towards is 2 degrees, 50%, well, roughly. And so there have been efforts, for instance, to integrate 25 to 40% reductions from 1990 by 2020 for developed countries. You find a reference to it in the Kyoto Protocol decision from Cancun in the preambular language. So that's an indication of science actually finding a way into negotiating texts. But that's just preambular language. And it's framed in a very contextual sort of way. It is not obligatory. It's purely aspirational. It's very clear that it's very soft sort of impact. So there are ways in which science finds itself into the outcomes and into the negotiations. But having said that, it is perhaps because of the second question that I was asked about some states being more conscious of the issue than others, and more conscious about the gravity of the issue than others, that the actual outcomes that we've had in the negotiations haven't been in keeping with the science. They weren't in keeping with the science in 1990 when we negotiated the Framework Convention. They weren't in keeping with the science when we started negotiating the Kyoto Protocol in 1995. The targets we have under the Kyoto Protocol were nowhere close to what the IPCC was suggesting would be appropriate to actually resolve the problem. And certainly the current situation where we're essentially taking notes of pledges that are not likely to lead us to 2 degrees, but are more likely to lead to 3 or 4 degree temperature increase, is not in keeping with the science. That's as was identified primarily because different countries place differing levels of significance on this issue, and it essentially requires lifestyle changes in some countries. They're not willing to do that. It requires putting constraints on development or putting constraints on economic growth in other countries, and those countries are not willing to do it. So it isn't just the question of how seriously countries take it, but it's also at what cost they will have to address it. So for instance, in a country like India, we take this climate change problem fairly seriously now, and in the last few years media attention has grown exponentially on climate change. The policy documents that we are now working with, the policy analysis, the data that we're working with has increased dramatically. The rigor of it has improved dramatically. We're thinking through a climate lens for many projects, and that's a substantive shift in the last 5 years. So we take this issue seriously, but having said that, 44% of India doesn't have access to electricity. And if you're going to provide them with access to electricity, we will need to grow our energy and will need certainly to grow our emissions in the near future. And emissions in 44% of 1.1 billion people is a large number of people without access to electricity. We can't leave a large proportion of our population in darkness. So at what cost are we going to address this problem that we take seriously? It's a dilemma. India's position on climate change has actually evolved quite rapidly in the last few years. This is in part because of our Environment Minister, Mr. Jairam Ramesh, who's played a very instrumental role in getting negotiators to a yes, as you would call it, in the international negotiations. He's also played a very useful role domestically in actually fostering a deliberative sort of conversation on issues that we've needed to think about but haven't thought about as much in India, on employing a climate lens to many of the policies that we currently have. Look at environmental clearances, for instance, with a view to the kinds of implications it might have long-term for climate change, the projects in question. So, I mean, the current minister has played quite a useful role in doing that. India's position traditionally, and it continues to hold that position today as well, has focused on equity issues. And as I said earlier as well, India is a country which has quite serious developmental concerns and has a very serious developmental agenda. And it is interested in improving the lot of its people, and that's what governments are elected to do, and that's what the government is trying to do. So it does need to balance those concerns with with what's required of it internationally, given the increasing role of India in the international economy in the context of climate change, and also what it expects of itself, because we do have a tradition of environmentalism in India. So we would like to be good citizens as far as climate change policy is concerned, and we are making efforts to do that. But we are also very much focused on equity. And what do I mean by equity? Now, traditionally, when India negotiated the Framework Convention on Climate Change, for instance, the principle of common but differentiated responsibility was a principle that was in part developed by India. And there are a wide array of views on what's common about the responsibility, what's differentiated, on what basis the differentiation should occur, to what extent there should be differentiation. And much of that is reflected in the differing interpretations one has of the Kyoto Protocol and of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. But India's position has always been that historically developed countries did contribute to creating this problem, and as a result they should take the lead in addressing it. But India is willing, and it's expressed itself as far more willing in the recent past, to do very substantial domestic actions on climate change, and it is doing those. I mentioned earlier the National Action Plan on Climate Change that India sort of drafted in the run-up to Copenhagen in 2009. The action plan identified 8 areas that needed further development, and it asked the relevant ministries to actually flesh out those 8 areas. Those include, as I mentioned earlier as well, solar, include forests, include the Himalayas, and various ministries have actually fleshed out those different areas. One of the areas that has been fleshed out incredibly well is the energy efficiency mission. And we now have Perform, Achieve and Trade scheme, which is efficiency trading in a sense. So emissions trading in the context of increasing energy efficiency of particular installations. So we have a whole range of instruments that are actually being crafted domestically 3 states are looking at emissions trading schemes. And we're exploring lots of different options. We're using market instruments, we're using traditional command and control instruments. There are a whole range of initiatives that we're taking, instruments that we're exploring and that we're going to implement. So India is seeking to be a good citizen and is trying to be that in the climate change debate and in the climate change negotiations, but it does fundamentally believe that developed countries need to take the lead in addressing this problem, and that whatever India does and other developing countries do should not act as a constraint on their efforts to lift their people out of poverty. And so if whatever India does, it will do subject to the constraint that 44% of its people don't have access to electricity. 80% of India's population lives on less than $2 a day. So there are a whole range of poverty issues that it needs to address, energy access issues that it needs to address. It will try and do that in the most responsible manner possible, given it would like to be a climate conscious, sort of good international citizen. But that project the project to be a climate conscious citizen in the international community cannot overtake India's poverty and development agenda. I guess folks like me who've spent 10 years and more following the international negotiations don't tend to be optimistic at the end of it. But having said that, it's been a few months since Cancun, so I have actually emerged from the fog of depression that every one of these negotiations usually sets me off onto. So I have cautious optimism about our capacity to change, both internationally and domestically. I think domestically, I have seen in the last 5 years dramatic changes in our levels of climate consciousness and in the policy debate, the level of policy debate, and how things have changed. And I think we need that kind of change domestically across the world to actually fuel international change. Because ultimately, it's a group of sovereign states that are negotiating at the UN. And unless change comes from within these countries and from below, the negotiating positions are not going to change. These are governments that are elected into power to cater to their people. You will only find change at the international level when there's domestic change. And I have seen dramatic domestic change in the last few years in India, and that makes me cautiously optimistic about other jurisdictions and therefore the ability of the international community to actually change course and more effectively address this problem. But I guess if I were a 15-year-old, I would be less optimistic about many of this, because the consequences of our failures, our generation's failures, will actually be visited on them. So I guess it would be a leap of faith for them to trust in us. But I hope it will not be a leap of faith too far.